We're over a year into this pandemic, and this is the point that France has reached, a third lockdown.
I know how difficult the efforts I'm asking of you are. I know the consequences for our country and for your lives.
The infection rate is going up, hospitalisations are going up, the daily death toll remains stubbornly high, and the message from doctors is stark. There are warnings of intensive care units being 400% over capacity, and of the most difficult decisions having to be made.
There is this Sophie's choice scenario which has begun to weigh on us. We are scheduled to shut down half of the operating rooms, meaning you must choose between 2 sick people to be operated on.
The head of intensive care at another hospital says the outlook is worse than frightening. April is going to be dreadful. New national restrictions will now apply across France, and frustration is building. This research by YouGov spoke to people in 22 countries about satisfaction with their government's handling of the pandemic. France is second lowest, just above Germany. So why has France reached this point? Well, as with most things with COVID-19, it's a potent mix of personalities, politics, history and science. And I'm going to look at the government's strategy this year, at the vaccine rollout, at the leadership of President Macron, and how the government's approached this from the very start, because its goal has always been clear.
Mr. Deputy, we have innovated and we have implemented until the end measures to contain the virus, maintain maximum individual and collective freedoms for the French people.
Back in March of last year, France moved swiftly, closing schools and bringing in a national lockdown. In the summer, as cases fell, restrictions were eased. A second wave then followed in the autumn, as did another temporary lockdown. Arguably, though, the most crucial decisions were made in January. By this point, cases in the UK were rising rapidly because of a new variant. It went on to have one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. But despite the clear threat of this new variant, France did not follow suit. There was no lockdown. It's a decision that's now fiercely criticised by some. The Paris magazine, Marianne, has written this piece, which we've translated, in which it asks, how can one label a government that knowingly decides to let nearly 300 of its citizens die every day, even though it could prevent it? And if that's Marianne magazine, there's also this from the head of infectious diseases at one Paris hospital.
We started to feel this wave coming about 2 weeks ago, and we've been warning the government that it would come in March because the modeling we had were quite bad. Unfortunately, the government didn't listen to us.
Not listening is the accusation, but President Macron is having none of that.
Est-ce que le 29 janvier, nous aurions dû confiner le pays?
We were right not to implement a lockdown at the end of January, because we didn't have the explosion of cases that every model predicted. There won't be a mea culpa from me. I have no remorse and won't acknowledge failure.
The President now, though, has admitted that some mistakes were made. And if that's the issue of the decision not to lock down in January, next we need to look at the vaccine rollout in France.
The heart of the battle over the next few weeks and months will be vaccination, morning, noon and night. I will be mobilised, the government will be mobilised, and all of the nursing staff everywhere in France will be mobilised in this battle.
The problem is that vaccine rollout has not been going to plan. This is how the magazine Le Point characterised the President's efforts. Mr. Macron riding a snail. Now, the pace is now picking up, but it's been a slow start for that vaccine rollout. The European Union and France itself has given 11% of adults at least one dose versus 45% in the UK, 28% in the US. And while there have been well-documented problems with vaccine supply, it's not just about that. It's also about whether French people want the vaccine. There are short-term and long-term factors here. The short-term, well, the President set the tone in January by saying the early results we have are not encouraging for 60 to 65-year-old people concerning AstraZeneca. We think that it's quasi-ineffective for people over 65. That wasn't and isn't true. Then in March, France suspended the use of the vaccine without waiting for the European regulator's ruling. Then when the regulator said the jab was safe, the suspension was cancelled. Doctors say all of this has had an impact. The BBC's Lucy Williamson spoke to one patient in a Paris ICU.
79-year-old Madeleine Lax arrived here after refusing the AstraZeneca jab. She didn't trust it with all her underlying conditions, she told me. But while waiting for the Pfizer one, she caught COVID. Has it changed her mind about the AstraZeneca vaccine? No, she said.
Then we have longer-term factors which have nothing to do with AstraZeneca. France has one of the highest rates of vaccine scepticism in the world. Social science professor Antoine Bristiel has told Reuters there is a strong correlation between trust in government and readiness to take a vaccine. He goes on to argue France's deep mistrust of the political class was a French peculiarity that isn't found in other countries. This is reiterated by the French historian Laurent-Henri Vanneau, who points to the Gilets jaunes protests in 2019. He argues if the French distrust vaccines, it's because they distrust their politicians. The degree of vaccine scepticism bears out the crisis in democracy that's been brewing for the past 30 years. For him, vaccine scepticism and the Gilets jaunes come from the same place. Now, of course, France doesn't have a monopoly on mistrust of the political class, but there's an argument that in France, this mistrust has become wrapped up with historic decisions around healthcare. This is Yasmin Serhan of The Atlantic.
The first was the revelations in the early 90s that the French government had knowingly distributed blood infected with HIV to hemophiliacs. There was a row over the safety of hepatitis B vaccinations in the late 90s. Those were concerning fears that the jab was linked to a rise in multiple sclerosis cases. Finally, there was the last pandemic, the swine flu pandemic in 2009, in which the French government found itself in kind of an opposite problem that it has today. It secured too many vaccines, and many people were opposed to taking them because they didn't feel like it was big of an issue in France.
All of which has created attitudes towards vaccinations that some doctors say they've been seeing for years.
The French population has always been anti-vaccinations. We see that here when we do the flu jabs. It's a mess every year. It's up to us as doctors to convince them that here the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages. That's clear.
We do, though, need to be careful here and keep our eyes on the COVID vaccination rates because they're picking up fast in France. There's increasing evidence that when push comes to shove, the French scepticism is being trumped by a desire to see off COVID-19. As the Paris-based journalist John Litchfield notes, the French vaccine programme is now humming along. The daily first jabbing rate is now approaching that in Britain. It may be humming along, but the start was slower than France wanted. And if we've looked at the vaccine rollout and the decision in January to not lock down, we can't consider France's predicament any further without focusing on the man in the middle of this, the president.
He stuck in his reputation back in January on this idea of not shutting down schools and having a kind of light confinement, a kind of third way, typical Macron third way. And suddenly his critics are saying, well, you know, that didn't work. You're now doing what we were urging you to do back then, which is to have a proper lockdown.
That's my colleague, the BBC's Hugh Schofield. He also describes how critics see an insufferable self-belief in the president. But to Macron's allies, he's making smart decisions based on the facts. Have a look at this in Politico. Emmanuel Macron drawn as Superman in front of the coronavirus sales with the headline, "It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Emmanuel Macron." Given the current situation in France's hospitals, we can be confident the Superman comparison will not work for everyone. But the article tells us the president boldly brushed off the predictions of epidemiologists in ruling out a January lockdown. There's a similar story in Le Monde under the headline, "How Emmanuel Macron's entourage portrays a president who would have become an epidemiologist." We're told Macron's aides say he's so bright and has read so much that he's now France's top authority on coronavirus and can do without experts. Now, we know Mr. Macron's a confident guy, and given that he created his own party from scratch, ran for president and won, he has some reason to be. And he's often revelled in an almost old-fashioned, grand version of leadership. Remember this in 2017? A vast ceremonial event at the Palace of Versailles, entirely focused on him and his vision for France. And this brand of ultra-confident politics has largely served him well. But there are risks to this approach when dealing with a virus that's indifferent to personality. And with Emmanuel Macron's aide saying he's now an authority on the virus, my mind did turn to this clip.
I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised that I understand it. Every one of these doctors said, "How do you know so much about this?"
Macron, the educated Trump, is how Tom McTague from The Atlantic puts it. Tom's argument being that both men, in very different ways, have shown a confidence or arrogance, depending on your view, that's been humbled by this virus. Certainly their macho approach was clear when they met. It was a handshake for the ages, lasting close to 30 seconds, and both men have since shown us there's a fine line between self-confidence as a political strength and a weakness. Donald Trump landed on the wrong side of that equation. He's out of office. And just like Mr. Trump, Emmanuel Macron is juggling two intertwined considerations. He wants to control the pandemic. He also wants to get re-elected next year. And many believe that he's concluded, just as Donald Trump did, that to do that, he has to protect the French economy. Reuters has reported that the biggest consideration, according to a person familiar with Macron's thinking, was the economy. Macron and his team believed other EU countries with 3 or more lockdowns would recover more slowly. The 2022 election is expected to be won or lost on how well France limits the economic fallout from the pandemic, the parliamentary source said. And if we put all of this together, a mutating virus, the slow start to the vaccine rollout, the change in lockdown policy, a looming election, we start to understand the moment France has reached, a moment of great uncertainty.
We can't pin down how long this wave will last. Will it last 2-3 weeks or 2-3 months? We don't quite know.
There are many unknowns for France, and from the very start, President Macron has been clear about the scale of the challenge. This was last March.
Nous sommes en guerre.
We are at war, a healthcare war. We're not fighting an army or another nation, but the enemy is here, invisible and making progress.
And in his eyes, Emmanuel Macron believes his leadership is what France needs in this war. Both the virus and in time the electorate will decide if that's the case.